Hey guys, it's Cheryl from Woodshop Diaries and welcome to my hallway. Super exciting. So our hallway has this closet with these double doors and it's about on my last nerve. First of all, you guys know how I feel about doors. Second of all, these doors are so hard to open and close and they're so loud. So I'm about to rip these doors off and build something much better. So if you guys are ready to transform this closet with me, let's go. The goal in reworking this closet space was to improve both function and aesthetics. Now, in full transparency, before we get started, I'll admit that I did lose a few cubic feet of storage space in the process of this build. I didn't need that space, so I was totally fine with losing it, but if you need every square inch of storage you can get, this may not be the project for you. Ironically, while I lost physical space, the end result has much better organization, so I ended up having empty shelves in the new closet even after putting everything back in. So first, I emptied this closet. Once all this stuff was out, I removed the shelves, brackets, doors, and trim. Basically, I'm going to be adding built-ins inside this door opening, so I just got rid of everything and I'll retrim it all after it's installed. I've been meaning to paint this hallway for 2 years now, so this seemed like a good time to go ahead and get that out of the way too. Now the space is completely blank and it's time to refill it. I took detailed measurements of the closet depth and the opening in the front. I want to basically build a cabinet that can kind of slide into this space and come flush to the front of the drywall. Once I figured out my overall cabinet size, I started building it by cutting down my plywood panels. Like most projects, I built this from birch plywood. The total closet depth from the back to the front edge of the drywall was approximately 22.5 inches, so I cut my plywood into strips 21.25 inches wide. This gives me room to add a 3/4 inch thick face frame and a 1/4 inch thick back panel. Then that gives me a 1/4 inch wiggle room that I can shim as needed because no walls are ever plumb or flat. Once I cut my plywood to the right width, I began cutting them down to build a bottom cabinet for drawers and a top cabinet for shelves. To save on plywood, instead of using solid panels for the bottom of the drawer cabinet, I used the leftover plywood strips. I assembled this cabinet using pocket holes and screws and ran 2 strips along the top, one at the front and one at the back. 1 strip along the back so that I can screw it to the wall once it's installed, and then I ran 2 strips at the front and back about 7 inches up from the bottom. The way that I'm building this into the wall, I'm going to run a 1x6 baseboard across the bottom, which is 5.5 inches tall, and I also want about 1.5 inches of face frame revealed, so that's where I got the 7 inches. This cabinet's overall size is about 2 inches smaller than the overall closet opening, so I should be able to just slide it in with some wiggle room on each side. Once the drawer cabinet was together, I assembled the top cabinet that will go above it. I assembled this with pocket holes and screws the same way, however, in this case, since these cabinets will have shelves instead of drawers, I installed a solid bottom and a solid top. The overall width of this cabinet matched the bottom cabinet, so I can slide it in on top when I'm ready to install it inside the closet. I forgot until after the fact that I also needed to add some strips across the back here to be able to secure it to the wall studs once installed. I cut to fit a 1/4-inch plywood panel to staple onto the back side of the top cabinet as well. I didn't add a backer onto the drawer cabinet because it seemed like kind of a waste of material since you won't see it. Now I needed to assemble the face frame. My plan was to make one giant face frame instead of 2 separate face frames on each cabinet. That way I can avoid any unnecessary seams. I used cedar wood for the face frame and for the cabinet door frames that I'll build shortly. Now, if you saw my bathroom vanity build from a while back, you may remember that I used cedar tongue and groove wood for the trim and for the doors there as well. So I did the same thing here and ripped the groove side of the boards off to use for the door frames and set these aside. Then I cut the face frame pieces from what was left. I ripped the top, bottom, and sides to 2 inches wide and the middle divider to 1.5 inches wide. Since these boards were so narrow, I was kind of afraid they would split when driving pocket hole screws, so I used the Craig micro jig for this part. This video isn't sponsored by Craig, or anyone for that matter, but just in case you work with small pieces very often, this little jig drills pocket holes about 30% smaller than the standard, and it's pretty handy to have for things like 1x2s. Once I drilled my pocket holes to assemble, I laid these face frame pieces out on my cabinet to make sure that I had everything in the right place. Then I assembled it using pocket hole screws. Because these holes are smaller, you do have to use the pan head screws instead of the washer head pocket hole screws. I flipped this giant frame over and made sure that it fit onto my cabinets the way that I intended. I designed it to overhang the sides about 1/2 inch on each side and overhang the insides about 3/4 inch. That made installing spacer blocks for the drawer slides super easy. I cut some 3/4 inch plywood strips to use as spacer blocks inside the cabinet. I glued and screwed these in, one at the bottom and one about halfway up, then I installed the drawer slides onto them. If you're interested in learning more about installing drawer slides, I will link a detailed video in the description below. After I installed all 4 pairs of the slides onto the cabinet, I moved on to building the drawer boxes. I cut the drawer box sides from 3/4 inch plywood. Now, my drawer fronts in this case needed to be about 11.5 inches tall, so I made my drawer boxes about 10.5 inches tall. I've got a whole detailed video that I'll link below on assembling drawer boxes, but to sum it up, I cut dados in these pieces to install the 1/4 inch plywood bottom, trimmed them to length, added the edge banding, and then drilled pocket holes to assemble. You'll see shortly what I'm talking about, but I didn't install a full drawer front on these boxes, I only installed a frame. So I was careful to drill my pocket holes as close to the top and bottom edges as possible so that the drawer front frame will cover them once they're in place. Once all 4 were together, I installed them into the cabinet. This cabinet was way too heavy to carry myself with the drawers already in, so after I made sure everything fit, I removed them to take the cabinet inside. I used a level to make sure that the cabinet was sitting nice and flat, and I did have to add a couple shims to one side, but the main thing was shimming up the back. Since the top cabinet has a plywood backer and this drawer cabinet doesn't, I needed to add some 1/4 inch plywood shims to the back before screwing into the studs. That way, they'll be flush across the front. Then I was ready to add the top section into the closet, but first I needed to cut out a hole in the back for access to this panel that's in the wall. This top cabinet was super heavy, so Danny helped me get it in place. Okay, so I've got the drawer cabinet installed. The top cabinet is screwed to it through the top supports, and now I need to screw the top cabinet to the studs as well at the top. I got impatient and I went ahead and installed 2 of the drawers, and then I have clamped the face frame on here. I just wanted to make sure that everything fit. I haven't glued it yet. I'm going to in just a minute. But first, I want to screw the top cabinets to the wall studs, and then I can deal with whatever else is going on here. Then I glued and nailed the face frame onto the front of the cabinets and checked that it was square before allowing it to dry. I installed the other 2 drawers as well before heading back to the shop to build the doors. I mentioned earlier that I used the groove side of the tongue and groove cedar boards to make the door frames. These pieces already had a pre-cut dado for the door panel and a pre-cut chamfered edge. So I cut these down with 45-degree mitered ends to make 4 door frames for the top section of this cabinet. I used birch plywood for the inside panel. I found that birch and cedar match really well if you find the most colorful birch that you can, which is usually by using the bad side of the plywood. After a test fit, I sanded everything well, then marked and drilled dowel holes at the corners to make the door frames. I assembled each door with dowels and glue and clamped until dry. I repeated for 4 identical doors and sanded them well after the glue had dried. They're not perfect, but after some detailed sanding, they look pretty good. Then I installed concealed hinges onto the doors. So I know some people will probably gripe about this, but I installed concealed hinges for inset doors on frameless cabinets. These are inset doors, but they're on face frame cabinets, not frameless. But frameless hinges are what I already had in the shop, so that's what I used. Now to make these work, similar to how I installed spacer blocks on the drawer sides, I just cut some spacer blocks for the hinges. I apologize for the terrible lighting here and the terrible angles. Everything I did inside this hallway was hard to capture because no matter where I put the camera, I was going to be right in front of it. So bear with me here, this is a pretty small space. I mounted the hinges onto these spacer blocks, and essentially that makes this a frameless cabinet as far as the hinges are concerned. I adjusted my hinges to get my spacing right, and then I added some scrap wood stop blocks at the top and bottom of the cabinet to keep the doors from swinging too far in. For whatever reason, I was having a mental block when it came to the drawer fronts, and I just did not want to deal with them at the moment. So while I tried to get motivated, I went ahead and trimmed this out. I replaced the baseboard across this area with a 1x6 board painted white, obviously, and then I trimmed out the opening with 1x4 boards and added crown molding and half round at the top. I have a complete video detailing how I trim my windows and doors just like this that I'll link in the video description if you want to check it out. At this point, I finally talked myself into finishing the drawers and adding the fronts. For these, I assembled 4 identical sized frames from cedar with pocket holes and screws. Then I brought these inside, clamped them onto the drawer boxes, and screwed them in from the inside. You'll notice here that this is why I drilled my pocket holes on the drawer boxes so close to the edge. I wanted to make sure that these frames would cover them once they're installed. So after adding the trim, I just didn't feel like it looked finished enough between the painted trim and the cedar face frame. There were a few small gaps in places that I just didn't like. So to fix this, I decided to trim the inside corners with cove molding. Then it was finally time for finish. I feel like this project has been never ending. I applied a couple coats of Minwax water-based Helmsman clear coat to seal the doors, drawer fronts, and face frame. Then I added some simple black knobs. And the very last part was the part that I should probably have done way before now, adding the shelves. For some reason, I have this habit of waiting until the very last to drill shelf pin holes in my cabinets. It would be much simpler to do this during the assembly process, but for some reason, I just never do. So just like always, I drilled shelf pin holes into the sides of the already installed cabinets, then cut and installed some plywood shelves using shelf pins. And with that, these closet built-ins are ready to fill back up. Like I mentioned before, even though I have less actual space now, it's way better organized. So I actually have almost half a cabinet still empty. And in case anyone says that I just threw it all away, the only thing that I threw away were 3 old pillows and a blanket. Everything else that was in this old closet is back inside this new cabinet. I will say that the visual difference this built-in makes in the hallway is night and day. These wood cabinets look so much better in here than those boring white doors. And I don't want to cringe every time I open these doors like I did those. I really hope you enjoyed watching this come together, and I can't wait to share what other projects that I've been working on with you all soon. Thanks so much for following along and watching, and until next time, friends, happy building.